Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel on Texas higher education's response to the pandemic. My name is Tom Lindsay, and I work at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Providing introductions to our esteemed panelists will be Dr. Larry Bell of the University of Houston. And we also want to thank Larry. Larry is the one who developed these panels on higher education in light of COVID. We're very grateful to you, Larry. And if you'll provide the introductions now, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. First, I want to introduce Tom. If you don't know him, he's director of the Center for Innovation and Education at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's been a great privilege to work with Tom in this effort. Universities and colleges are facing tough financial challenges as more and more students are opting for high quality, cost competitive programs during this crisis, the COVID crisis. So one of the theme questions in this discussion today, I think, is what is the state's role in addressing what are certainly going to be some significant budget shortfalls? And as this falls on taxpayers and stakeholders, what benefits should Texas industries, businesses, and taxpayers expect in return? We have an enormously distinguished panel today, and I'd very briefly introduce Honorable Paul Bettencourt, Senator Bettencourt, who's the chair of the Senate Property Tax Committee. We have Dr. Harrison Keller, who is the Commissioner of Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. And we're pleased to have Stephen Johnson, Dr. Stephen Johnson, who is president of the Independent Colleges and Universities of Texas. So with that, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Larry. I'm going to address questions to our panelists, and we're going to go in alphabetical order. So we'll begin with Senator Bettencourt, then with Dr. Johnson, then with Dr. Keller. First question is the same question for the three of you, and that is, what is one fundamental way that the COVID pandemic has affected Texas higher education institutions? Senator Bettencourt will begin.
Well, you don't need the Aggie in the family here to tell you the obvious. And the obvious is simply this. We're looking at what is, at least a chapter out of Alex Huxley's Brave New World, because we're walking into a semester where we're going to be doing more virtual learning than ever before. There's a lot of concern about how long, classroom participation can go interrupted without having what has been typical for business of having a business interruption due to COVID and having the facilities cleaned and people in quarantine due to testing. Look, it's just we're a recognition of the obvious that this is going to put a great deal of emphasis on virtual learning. Now, of course, the question is, what is the balance between virtual learning and classroom learning? Now, I'm a member of both the education and the higher education committees in the Senate. They're ably chaired by Larry Taylor and Senator Brandon Creighton. And, without not speaking for them, we also are obviously in a slower budget year than we were in the last cycle when I was the work group chairman of the Finance Committee for Chairman Jay Nelson, looking at basically, higher ed. And we did a lot of things in that work group that we're probably not going to be able to do this time around due to lack of funding. And certainly we're starting in X million dollars in the hole on a state budget at this time. So look, for everyone to recognize two things. One, obviously a pandemic and an energy slump together means a budget crunch. But I think fundamentally, we have to accept that what's happening in society now, with whether it's the Zoom call we're on here or the virtual learning that's going to be taking place in K through 12 or in universities, and the fact that a lot of business activities switch to virtual, is going to leave really, I think, a permanent impact on how society functions. And I think if we didn't have 2 feet into the virtual age in the 21st century, I think the pandemic and the result of that is put us in there for sure.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, if I hear you correctly, you're saying that we need to leverage technology in order to learn to do more with less going forward.
Dr. Tom, no question. Okay, look, we're in a situation where we're going to have to do more with less in the next budget cycle for sure. And importantly, I think that the conditions are already there to allow that. There is already so much emphasis based on virtual technology at this point in time. I'm hearing from constituents that are that are freshmen that are entering that are having 80% of their classes are going to be online. Now, the question for the rest of the panel, is that really a good thing? Okay, are we making, is that the right decision? I mean, I've got parents that are asking, I'm shipping my kids off to dorm rooms and they're having all virtual classes at the major flagship institutions, at A&M, I mean, UT for sure. So we really have to have that discussion because I think that especially entering freshmen need some anchoring in the real world as opposed to just the virtual world. But we got this issue at community colleges, at every level of higher education.
Yes, thank you, Senator. Dr. Johnson?
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me. I'd echo quite a bit of what Senator Bettencourt said. I mean, I think certainly, this move to online education was already taking place in many of the sectors across the ecosystem. I think this is accelerating that. I think that makes for growing pains, particularly for institutions that may not be as far ahead on that curve in terms of being able to not only move online, but move online with quality educational services with great outcomes. I think, though, that creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity for institutions to accelerate that and achieve at faster scale maybe what would have taken a longer period of time in terms of really reaching quality online education. I think there are wonderful examples across all the sectors of institutions doing it right. I think there are some very interesting models both in the public universities and my institutions and the private institutions as well. And then there's models at the national level, such as Western Governors University, which is basically built for this type of a scenario. And much, I think, of what we can do across sectors is share best practices and help one another along to better be able to impact students in this kind of chaotic time, but more importantly, the post-COVID-19 world, where we can hopefully take many of these learnings forward and ever personalize the educational journey for students, which I'm a giant proponent of. The more we can individualize, the more we can move away from comparing each one to the average and having a standard path rather than recognizing students need an individual pathway. I think all the better. I think it also provides an opportunity for institutions to really demonstrate and stretch the muscles around flexibility in how they manage their operations. And we're hearing quite a bit of feedback from our private institutions that that is what's taking place, is that it's a motivation for the institution to really take a hard look at themselves, not only to meet the demand now of this world that we live in, but how are they going to manage to meet the needs of students as we move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. If I hear you correctly, you're saying that with regard to online education, the train had already left the station years ago, but the pandemic is pushing it even faster down the track.
I think that's exactly right, Tom. I think that, many institutions, for example, the ICUT institutions, nearly half of them, over 20, offer 150 online degree programs already, but they're very traditional and oftentimes are hybrid models. And so there's always the ability to use this time of a crisis to really learn how to do it better.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Commissioner Keller?
Well, I'm gonna echo some of the insights from the senator and that Steve just made, because of course almost every aspect of our lives has been disrupted now. If we think about how we're using technology, how we're using physical spaces, and of course higher education is no different. And but in higher education, we're still in the midst of experiencing the greatest disruption to the operations of our colleges and universities that we've seen since the end of the Second World War. But of course, as Steve and the senator pointed out, disruption doesn't have to mean turmoil. There's also an opportunity to accelerate the pace of innovation. And that's true in our economy, it's true in our institutions, it's true in our daily lives. So for higher education, certainly this moment presents some formidable challenges. There are increased costs that the institutions have taken on. And at the same time, they saw multiple revenue streams take substantial hits like we haven't seen in recent memory. But there's also unique opportunities and I would say a responsibility for higher education to help us overcome this public health crisis, accelerate economic recovery, and contribute to a better future for our communities, our state, and our nation. I wouldn't take issue with anything that's been said already. I do think that this is a time that we're not really going to go back to the same kind of normal before, particularly on how we use digital technologies. That we had not just individual faculties, but departments and whole institutions that hadn't really done very much with digital learning before, that all of a sudden have been thrust into it. And what I've heard consistently is, when you've got that creative energy channeled in a new direction, there are a lot of kind of things that are happening that are some kind of first time issues, or as folks are making that conversion. But there's also a lot of really interesting work happening, and folks are changing their calendars, they're changing how they're delivering courses and programs in ways we would have never anticipated. And I think it's going to be hard to put that back in the bottle.
Thank you, Commissioner. If I hear you correctly, you're saying that the creativity that this pandemic has spawned is producing a number of good news stories from which we'll benefit going forward.
Indeed. That when you channel that creative energy of faculty and students in this new direction, there are a lot of exciting things that are happening, and I think that's going to continue even as we have successfully navigated the pandemic.
Yes, thank you. Senator Bettencourt, back to you. Given your role on Senate Finance and Senate Ed and Senate Higher Ed, at this point, how precise can you be about the size of the pie from which public ed and higher ed will be drawing in the next session?
Well, Dr. Lindsay, I think Commissioner Keller knows that there's a little good news immediately, which is that there's the CARES Act has come through federal funding, and I believe it's about $57 million is coming from the governor's Abbott's fund. Lieutenant Governor Patrick has been discussing that lately as well, and that's money that can be used for some of the COVID expenses that higher ed is having. And to your basic point, we've seen some recovery in sales tax, which is actually pretty positive. I'll give you some numbers. In June, we were only 2.67 billion in collections, but that was 6.5% less than the same month last year. But in July, we actually were 4.3% above it at 2.98 billion in collections from Hager's comptroller's office. So we've seen, both sides of the collection in the last couple of months. Actually, one go positive, which is really quite positive news for the budget. But look, the reality is this: whenever there's a situation where there's going to be a budget shortfall, higher ed knows that that's not the year to be running in asking for tuition revenue bonds and a whole bunch of other, optional, related items for the legislature to handle. This is going to be a blocking and tackling, understanding what has changed because of virtual learning, which will be ubiquitous everywhere in all the institutions, and really how we can do more with less is the best way to describe it. So, so Tom, I can't give you exact number of what the pie is going to look like, except that I'm pretty sure we're not going to see these increases that we had in the last biennium of $1 billion in general revenue that increases, and also formula funding was up 900 million. The odds of both those numbers being up that same amount are pretty low.
Yes, understood. Thank you. President Johnson, you, like Commissioner Keller, came on just before COVID hit. Let me ask you this question from your perspective here from iCut. Businesses and industry are pursuing employees with degrees and certificates, but increasingly they seek to understand what skills those credentials contain. So my question for you is, what opportunities exist now and will exist after COVID to better link relevant skills to the needs of employers?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tom. Let me take off my iCut hat for a little bit. And you're right, Commissioner Keller and I both came on at about the same time into our positions. Previous to this position, I did work as Chancellor for WGU Texas here. And certainly, at least in that environment, that is much of the conversation that we were having with an institution like WGU, where we were simply, very focused on breaking down curriculum and program to match, skills taught versus skills sought by the market. Having said that, that's a unique institution created by governors 20 years ago to help states solve state issues, particularly on the workforce side. It was created with a clean sheet of paper. And so they're very comfortable in the language of skills and skills mapping across the curriculum. Coming to the private institutions here in Texas, I can tell you there's a lot of that work going on as well. And it's about how to learn the language and learn the skill set of taking an existing curriculum and understanding how to translate those skills that are acquired through a liberal arts education or a technical education, even at a university, so that employers can really understand that, yes, you have a credential, but what are the skills that credential signal to the employer that you're able to use within their needs. It is a shift in focus. Traditionally higher education had been a very discrete kind of experience in the traditional model. You're 18 years old, you go to university, you spend your 4 years, you're 22, you graduate and begin your career. I think ever increasingly we see open loop learning where students are going to be returning back for more and more skills, upskilling, reskilling. Many have said the most important skill moving forward is not learning new things, it's unlearning old things and learning new things. I think that's the direction that we're headed. And I think COVID-19, like many of the issues we're talking about, is going to help accelerate that process. As institutions reimagine curriculum and reimagine programs and the delivery of those mechanisms, to Commissioner Keller's point of view, in terms of using data to make those decisions, I think you can ever increasingly be impactful on this skills discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I take your point. It probably would be good to let our audience know that most of us who are older, we think of college as 18 to 22-year-olds going to a residential college full-time. But in fact, that's only refers today to about 1 in 5 students who are seeking some sort of post-secondary education, degree, or certificate. Today, what we call non-traditional students form the majority of students seeking post-secondary degrees or credits. And that means that today, the majority of students are over 25 and or working full-time and or with families of their own to support. So for them, non-traditional education has always been the only way to the American dream, even before COVID, it seems.
Exactly. It's what I like to refer to. They're not non-traditional, they're the contemporary student of today.
Yes.
I mean, that really, and that's going to continue as they go through their work life. They will continue to be students.
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Keller, and again, knowing that you've come in at about the roughest time to come in, and you have all of our good wishes. Can you tell us what kind of things has the Higher Education Coordinating Board been working on in the short time that you've been in office to help students and universities navigate this crisis?
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. Yeah, it certainly isn't the job that I thought that I'd signed up for this last fall, but it's always interesting. In general, one of the things that I've stressed when I came in as commissioner is I thought that the agency needed to reposition itself from more of a traditional regulatory posture to more being a resource for institutions, for policymakers, and for students and their families. And so our primary role in this time has been about being a resource to the institutions. And so, of course, we're in constant communication with the governor's office and institutional leaders, policymakers, other stakeholders. And so quickly, I could tell you about some of the things that we launched. For example, we helped organize some of the work in Governor Abbott's Frontline Childcare Task Force to develop and launch a portal for childcare options for frontline essential workers. We also partnered with Greater Texas Foundation and Trellis Foundation to organize an emergency student aid initiative. And so that's still in process. We're still raising money from philanthropy to help support students at 2-year and 4-year institutions through targeted block grants. And some of that is for direct support for students, but just as importantly, some of those block grants have been about helping institutions set up new capabilities to be able to get aid out in a way that would be more targeted. So about half of our institutions, of our public institutions, already had systems in place where they could get emergency aid to students who need it just in time. But a lot of our institutions, especially smaller institutions, didn't really have those systems and processes in place. So we've been working with them to set that up. And that's been important for how they can deploy some of these CARES Act emergency aid dollars and be more strategic. So instead of doing an across the board allocation, you can make sure you get those aid dollars where they're most needed. Of course, we continue to work closely with the Governor's Strike Force to open Texas, and we were working with the Lieutenant Governor's Strike Force on reopening the state economy. And another thing that I would highlight is that we have a dedicated web page that we set up for institutions, and that includes an FAQ for institutions, for borrowers, for other stakeholders. So there are some places we've been able to provide some more flexibility, some regulatory relief as institutions are navigating these times. There are other places we've been able to work with the governor's office to provide some waivers because our policy environment, our rules and our regulations never anticipated this kind of environment. So our statutes, our rules, our reporting requirements all assume traditional modes of delivery where most of the instructions are going to be able to happen face to face. And so we've had to pivot pretty quickly on that. The last thing that I'd highlight that the senator alluded to, and I think is very, very important, is that the governor, in close consultation with Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Speaker Bonin and the leadership of Senate Finance and House Appropriations prioritized higher education in these governor's emergency education relief funds. And the first tranche of funding, which will go out in a few days, was focused on making sure that we'd maintain our need-based financial aid programs and not pull back on those commitments to students and their families. And right behind that, they committed funds for additional emergency aid, for reskilling and upskilling, and also then a little bit of funding for strategic investments in that data infrastructure and in improving the quality of online education. So I have to say, you know, when I've been in calls with some of my counterparts across the country, we've seen massive cuts announced in New Jersey and Ohio and California. And our Texas policymakers really have kind of gone another direction where they've said, look, we're going to use strategic investments in higher education as a way to help accelerate the recovery. And that's an importantly different flavor than we're seeing in a lot of places right now.
Yes, well, this is encouraging news. Thank you, Commissioner. For those students, and I'm glad you mentioned the availability of need-based aid, for those students who are worried because of financial exigency and the effect of COVID about whether or not they can go to college, whether they can afford it, is there any place they should go to on your on the THECB website to find out about this need-based aid, or how might they best track that down?
So primarily, we're directing students to their financial aid offices. So the financial aid offices already have processes in place for when students have experienced hardship and are going to need a re-estimation of their financial aid packages. Any student who would be worried that the state might pull back and not make good on their Texas grant or their TEOG or their tuition equalization grant doesn't need to worry. The governor or the legislative leadership have prioritized students in financial aid, and there are no cuts that are being made this year in those need-based aid programs, which is a significant statement about the priority of students to our policymakers. And in addition, there will be some additional funds that are going to be directed from the funds I mentioned, the CARES Act funds that are part of this, the governor's discretionary funds around emergency aid. And then there'll be a portion of it that's specifically earmarked for reskilling and upskilling. So, you know, of course, we've had more than 3 million Texans who filed for unemployment since March. And a lot of the jobs that folks have lost aren't coming back, or they're not coming back quickly. So there are going to be a number of people, not just traditional age students, but older students who are going to need to reskill and upskill to be able to get back into the economy, get back on their feet. And even a short-term workforce credential can make all the difference for somebody being able to provide for their family and contribute to the Texas recovery. And that's something that is a priority for the governor, for our legislative leadership as well.
Excellent. Well, that's very encouraging news. Thank you, Commissioner.
And Dr. Tom, if I can add.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, this is an important point that the commissioner just made, because that 57 million was followed with 118 million. And it's in the areas that Commissioner Keller just talked about. $46.5 million for targeted financial aid for upskilling and reskilling of displaced workers. And by the way, Commissioner, my Senate district is like #1 on unemployment benefits right now because of the energy downdraft in the economy. But another 46.5 million is for emergency student support, so families and students that have been severely financially impacted by COVID-19 can stay enrolled. 15 million for strategic education and workforce data structure, 10 million to improve quality of online learning. So that's a total between the two releases of funds of $165 million that have just come through the governor, with obviously the support of Speaker Bond and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and all the legislative committees that are working on it.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, we go back to you here for the next round of questions. Senator, what do you anticipate the legislature doing in this coming session in an attempt to resolve the cost revenue challenges that have been imposed by the pandemic?
Well, one of the things that I'd love to hear from the panel as well is we're going to have to get government regulation out of the way of how we respond to this. Okay. There may be rules and set asides. We really have to look at this as we're going to have to think out of the box on some of these answers. I look back at my legislative career because I think I helped greatly expand dual credit. Okay. A few years back, and that was I didn't realize it was game breaking or ground, shaking, but it was, because Harris County was the first county to expand dual credit for high school seniors going into what is predominantly more of a community college, or certainly freshman or sophomore level, a university, whether virtual or in person. So we're going to need to look at solutions like that. It really won't help us if we decide that the cost of online education actually exceeds the cost of classroom bricks and mortar. That won't be a good answer, because we've already, incurred a significant amount of debt for bricks and mortar. And while we can make strategic investments in IT infrastructure and things we've talked about already, that's we're going to need some creative thinking, because we're simply not going to have a couple $2 billion or more, at least in my opinion only, to be able to push into higher ed like we did in the last biennium. But to the commissioner's comment, it is the legislative leadership has clearly signaled that that higher ed is important, because that's generally where people get the job skills to get into some really higher paying jobs, which is the primary growth engine of the economy. So that's something that I don't see changing, because I know everybody that's involved in it, and they all think the same way, quite frankly, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on. But monetary limitations are going to be important this year. So let's figure out ways to do things better, faster, quicker. And if that means we need to change our regulations to get ourselves, the government, out of the way of delivering the product to the students, and other people that use the university services, businesses, et cetera, then we need to do that.
Thank you, Senator. If I understand you correctly, among the things that the legislature will be looking at is whether and to what extent some regulations impede the nimbleness and the innovation that universities need, especially after COVID.
Right, because look, we're looking at changing the delivery system. President Johnson would come to my office back when he had his other job, okay, and talk about what innovations and cost savings you could have in a virtual environment. We're going to need to look at that and embrace that really systems wide, not just the major systems, but really the entire higher education delivery system, and look at it, because those are the ideas we need to hear about. And I guarantee you those will be the ones that will get a lot of questions in the legislative committee hearings, whether it's higher ed, finance, or any other committee, just because people will be looking for those type of solutions. Look, when you have a downturn and you have disruption in the economy, it's actually that type of change can be a really good focal point for doing new things and changing what has been could have been a somewhat stagnant delivery channel, and shock them into the new reality that we're in. So I'm actually kind of looking forward to hearing what ideas we're going to hear from, whether it's from the colleges, universities, whether they're independent, in-person, hybrid, et cetera. And I know that the Commission on Higher Ed is going to be talking about this consistently.
Yes. Thank you, Senator. Dr. Johnson, let me ask you this. And before I ask you this question, let me remind our audience, you have about 4 minutes left to submit your questions for our panelists. Dr. Johnson, does the move to online higher ed, to the extent that it's now been driven by COVID-19, does it reveal any issues related to access for Texans to high-speed broadband across the state?
Thanks, Tom, for the question. The short answer is yes. I currently serve on Governor Abbott's Broadband Development Council, which was created in the last legislative session. It's being led by Senator Perry and Representative Ken King in many respects. Looking at this issue in particular, it is not a new issue, not only in education, both higher and K through 12, but more broadly within the economy itself. The notion that access to high-speed broadband is defined, by the FCC is essential for commerce. It's hard to run a small business in a small town without stable, quality high-speed broadband. I think definitely, we've traditionally looked at it as an accessibility issue, and that's still critically important. That last mile, where oftentimes it's difficult for consumers, students, others to get high speed to the home directly. The other side of it, though, is more focused upon the affordability. And the issues there are not access to. There is access. There is high-speed broadband. The problem is communities that cannot afford. And clearly, we've all seen the stories with the COVID-19, particularly at the end of the spring semester within the public school space, where school districts were being very ambitious and unique and driving their school buses around and parking them with broadband for students to be able to access. But clearly, it points to a broader issue, and it's kind of a common theme that I think we've been talking about is the acceleration of some of these policy issues and their potential solutions and responses being driven by this crisis of COVID-19. I can tell you on the council itself, we're excited to prepare a report to the legislature this fall for consideration for next session. And much of it will be focused upon those two areas. How can we best use public-private partnerships, particularly for the accessibility, but also for affordability as well. But yes, to your original question, I would say it definitely points out an issue of digital divide that has existed prior to the COVID-19 world we live in.
Yes. I think a lot of us learned for the first time as a result of COVID that there are a number of school districts in the Valley that do not have internet access. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Keller, looking ahead to the legislative session, what are some of the most important things that you think the state should do with regard to higher education policy?
So first, just picking up on the points that Senator Bettencourt made, the major issue, of course, is going to be around finance. So a few months ago, what I had heard from Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and the Speaker and the other legislative leadership is they were interested in setting the stage for a higher education session as a companion to the work that they've done on public ed. And of course, that rug got pulled out from under us a few months ago. So of course, finance is going to be the dominant issue. Now, what typically happens in states, and what we're already seeing play out in a number of states around the country, is this traditional playbook. So the state budgets get tight, the states pull back support for higher education disproportionately because they want to protect Medicaid and they want to protect public schools, and the assumption is, well, higher education can go to other revenue sources, and in particular, that means higher tuitions, that means higher student debt loads. That traditional playbook is, I think, in what's hanging around the background in Texas that I would argue is already off to a much better start than we see in some other places, is that actually slows down economic recovery. So, those strategic investments in affordability and student aid are really important, not just for the near term and making sure that students can stay on track, but for the longer term. But a lot of how fast we're going to be able to get through this and fuel economic recovery is going to turn on how well we can unlock student potential. And so the number one issue will be around finance. I'm going to argue this isn't a time to hunker down and just try to figure out a way to keep doing more of what we're doing, that we're going to need to reduce some of those kinds of barriers. I'll give you a concrete example of what the senator was talking about, that, you know, right now, if you have innovative partnership between a community college and a university, that means students can get through more efficiently with fewer semester credit hours. Both institutions lose money. The incentives are to keep students in your institutions taking as many credits as possible, as opposed to making sure that students are making efficient progress to high value credentials. So that there's a concrete example of where you've got a traditional finance system, and the assumptions and incentives that are built into that just do not line up with the policy goals of the state. So I would say finance, affordability for students, and innovation would be my top three issues that I think are going to be very important in higher education policy.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have some questions from our audience. First question is for any and all of you. And that question is, what role do and should trade schools play in addressing the issues that higher education faces in light of COVID?
Well, I mean, there's something that we always focus on, and I know in finance committee hearings, Tom, because look, if you know, everyone that's in the oil patch is and really in Texas is used to the boom bust cycle of energy. Okay, now when we get back to the boom cycle, and we will, because that's just what happens. Okay, is that if you can draw bead and weld, you can make $100,000. Okay, you know, in a good time. For a while, people driving a commercial license in Midland, Odessa, you made six figures too. So depending upon the needs of the economy at any one time, trade designations are very important. And there's also, we haven't talked about the initiatives that have been around in the past, but the prior programs of 2030 and all those about trying to get people to get to a 4-year degree or get a certification within 6 years. Either way, get certified on something or get a 4-year college degree. Regardless of the measurement, the important thing is that they get it, because they're worth more in the economy long term that way. And so trade school has always been very important in our calculations.
Thank you, Senator. We have did either one of the other two gentlemen want to comment on that question about trade schools and their role?
No, I'd agree with the senator. I mean, there's
okay.
The trade schools and our community and technical colleges are going to play a vital role, especially around reskilling and upskilling.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. I think it's back to that whole discussion around skills that can be acquired and used in the marketplace. And if that's a place to begin a career, that's wonderful. And if that's the career that is, to Senator Bettencourt's point, can create a life that's good for you and your family, then all the better. But I'm a firm believer in the more options, the better for students.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw a statistic a couple of years ago, long before COVID. The average age of a plumber in Texas is 58. So, right.
Well, but you know what? They're making pretty good money right now from what I've seen.
Oh, yeah. I talk to my plumber every time he comes over. He says, it's a great job. He says, you just have to remember not to bite your fingernails.
or get along with your customers. I guarantee.
Yes, that's right. That's right. We have another question from the audience for any and all of you. And this member of the audience asks, isn't this crisis an opportunity to cut back on administrative bloat?
Well, the answer is yes. Okay. Because look, it's whenever you have a crisis like this, you have to rethink what are we doing and why. Okay. Now, the administrative overhead expense is always something that we look at because, and actually I remember the last finance hearings, there was kind of a competition between the major university systems that said, well, you know, my overhead is this, my overhead is 3.5%, whatever. It was, clearly people had gotten the message to that. Look, when people are struggling to make ends meet, and the key thing is, I think it was Commissioner that said that we've had a substantial unemployment problem. So, you know, with my property tax hat on, this is not the time to be jacking up people's property taxes. It's also not the time to be jacking up tuition. Okay, you know, and because there is a seesaw between what the state gives and what tuition can bring, because that's the primary alternate revenue source for most institutions. But at this point in time, it's efficiency that matters, and new ideas, and I love Commissioner Keller's comment about, because you're right. Right now we're de-incentivizing people to work together to come up with a delivery system that may get 2 years in community college and 2 years at a higher institution, and boom, they're out of there, or maybe they shorten the time down. And that's the type of things that we need to be putting smart money on to fixing real problems.
Thank you, Senator. And just for the members of our audience who may not be familiar with the term administrative bloat, back in 2011, a professor at Johns Hopkins, Benjamin Ginsberg, did a national study which was titled "The Fall of the Faculty: the Rise of the All-Administrative University and Why It Matters." And what Ginsberg finds is that 40 years ago, faculty outnumbered staff on universities, which makes sense given that teaching and learning is their central mission. But today, there are as many staff as there are faculty on universities. That's where the term administrative bloat comes from. And again, for our audience, this is not simply a Texas issue. This is a national issue. I'll let our other two panelists respond if they would like.
So I'll chime in on that one on a couple of fronts. First, and more specifically, there was an important point that the senator made earlier about the way that we regulate institutions, and are we looking more at inputs versus outputs kind of thing, because I can tell you firsthand what I saw working in a public university is some of the compliance reporting itself also drives cost. So you can have where institutions are required to report 7 different definitions of student, and there are a number of, if you look at on the public universities versus the private universities, the number of staff who are dedicated to compliance reporting, it's far less on the private university side, on the independent university side. And so there's an opportunity there, as the senator was saying, when you streamline and innovate, where you can also reduce some of those overhead costs downstream. But in general, the traditional perspective has been that there's this iron triangle with access and cost and quality, and that's been the way that higher education policy conversations have been framed for a long time. So I think we're in a moment where we can take some lessons from innovations in healthcare and in other sectors about how we could aim more towards what in healthcare they call the triple aim, where you have better experience and better outcomes and lower cost. Like what are the levers that we could pull? And some of those will be better collaboration across institutions, more transparency about the costs and what the pathways are like, so students and their families can make better choices. So there are things that don't have to cost a lot of money, but make a huge difference for how students are able to experience higher education, how efficiently they can navigate it, and ultimately what that cost of that system should be.
Thank you, Commissioner. Dr. Johnson, anything you want to say on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo, both the senator and commissioner. I think, clearly representing the private not-for-profit institutions in this state, Commissioner Keller is right. I mean, the amount of staff that's required to do any kind of that reporting is significantly lower, and clearly, given the lack of state regulation in that sense, means institutions can be quite innovative. I think fundamentally, to my mind, whether that's from the community college to the public universities to the not-for-profits, it's utilizing this time to better design a system that always at its core is the student experience. And to Mr. Keller's point, that iron triangle, I think, is a myth. I think there are ways to achieve the kind of quality and individualized journey for students that create great outcomes for them. And I think there's ways to do it at reduced cost. And in many respects, that's because institutions can be innovative. And I think certainly the ability to work across institutional sectors is one of the keys, and not seeing the system as a series of opportunities and silos across institutional type, but rather for students to be able to see a pathway through multiple types of institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We have another question from our audience. We have an audience member who asked, what are the three of you hearing about fall enrollments? Are they down? And if so, how much?
So here's what we're seeing with our public institutions is overall, there seems to be a strong correlation between the mission of the institutions and what their fall enrollment projections are looking like. So if you look at the flagships, are generally reporting that they're going to be flat, maybe slightly up. Of course, those institutions have more levers to pull. They have long wait lists of students that are interested in filling those slots. As you go into more broad access institutions, so that are going to be more like regional universities, or students that serve larger percentages of Pell eligible students, then the projected fall enrollments are looking a lot less stable right now. And in particular, a couple of warning signs we're seeing are fewer students transferring from the 2 years into the 4-year institutions. That's going to be something we need to watch carefully. For the 2-year institutions, honestly, it's a little hard to say right now. Their enrollments generally, on average, look like they're going to be down. But what we saw at the beginning of the summer, where they were projecting significant decreases in their enrollments of sometimes 15, 20% or more. And then at the last minute, a lot of students enrolled, and overall for the summer, enrollments ended up being up by about 11%. So it's a little too early to say exactly where that's going to come down. Most of the community college presidents I've talked to in the last few days think they're probably going to end up slightly down from where they were this last year.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Keller. Dr. Johnson, Senator Bettencourt, any thoughts on this?
Tom, from the independent institution perspective, it follows closely to what Commissioner Keller described in terms of the public universities. There seems to be the research intensive and larger institutions, seeing fairly, at least maintaining and in some places growing. As you move down the spectrum, to Commissioner Keller's point, there becomes a bit more instability and uncertainty, particularly those that are open access in many respects, like many of our HBCUs. And so it bears watching on our part, but it does mirror in many respects the public university trends as well.
Thank you. Another question we have here from our audience, and that is, in light of COVID, are any Texas universities considering a tuition freeze?
So yes, tuitions were generally set at the universities, and we had some institutions that, particularly this summer, lowered tuition. And that may have been one of the drivers of why we saw increased enrollments this summer. A lot of also what I heard is that the summer jobs weren't available for students as much, and so that was also driving the enrollments. One of the most interesting examples, I'll defer to Steve, would be what's going on at Paul Quinn College, that had announced an innovative partnership with a totally new kind of degree plan at lower cost. So I'd defer to Steve to talk about that.
Thanks, Commissioner. Yeah, I think Paul Quinn College and President Sorrell have been very innovative, both prior to COVID-19 and then in the world that we're living in now. They actually announced a tuition reduction and a new model. Every student was given a laptop. They're redesigning the curriculum to be fully online, which is a significant change for them. The model before that had been very innovative, was a very campus-centric, East Dallas-centric kind of a model with students embedded in the community. When I talked with President Sorrell, they still want to continue that, but they're going to adapt to the world that we're in today. And so I think, but there's an example of one of the institutions we talk about enrollments that may be a little bit more problematic. I think exactly the opposite is happening at Paul Quinn, because they're responding in such an innovative way in a community that really needs innovative ways for students to achieve their educational goals.
Thank you, President Johnson. Senator Bettencourt, our audience member, also asked in that question whether the state legislature is looking at tuition freezes going into the next session.
I tell you, tuition freezes always comes up. A colleague of mine, Senator Schwartner, constantly brings that up every year. And in an environment like the one we're in, again, you'll find me and my House counterpart, the Ways and Means Committee. We're speaking out against property tax increases. And believe me, there'll be a bunch of people speaking out against tuition increases. And look, when you have an economic shock and your public loses the ability to pay, you have to think, well, this is a time where, fortunately, a lot of institutions have reserves and they can draw down on them a little bit, because the university system is not without that in the state of Texas. But more importantly, I think here's the big point. Competition is important. And what you're seeing by the last example that both the commissioner and the president discussed is an institution that's coming up with a new competitive way to pitch services. It's important that we think that really is the driver here. Clearly, you'll have a lot of last minute decisions by people, the families, or by students to go to anything from 2-year community colleges to 4-year. Maybe they won't get into the flagships, but they'll jump in at the last moment in a smaller system school. Maybe they're going to go online. What's happened is, when you have a disruptive market force of this magnitude, it puts people's decision-making process off until they can get a full handle on all the options that they can choose. So I think that the right answer is to put your options on the table and expect that you're going to get a lot of last-minute business, because we're seeing the same thing in the sales tax numbers. Everybody projected them way down. They're actually up better, because the economy has been more resilient than we thought. I think that the needs of the workforce in Texas will always be there. We've got Tesla showing up in a big way outside of Austin. Not to brag on A&M, but looks like they're in the pharmaceutical, vaccine business. Okay, and there's all sorts of things happening at all these institutions with public-private partnerships with a whole number of businesses that could make a difference locally, and in some cases, like Tesla, that type of magnitude makes a difference on the overall economy of the state. So, I think everybody needs to stay tuned and wait and see what the final numbers are, but they're not going to be as bad as they originally forecasted. That's what we're seeing right now, unless we have some other major economic shock before Labor Day.
Thank you, Senator Bettencourt. That's encouraging news. And I think we've heard a lot of encouraging news from all three of our panelists. I want to thank Senator Bettencourt. I want to thank President Johnson, and I want to thank Commissioner Keller, and I want to thank Larry Bell for putting this all together. We hope you've enjoyed our conference. Have a good afternoon.